You can wake up tomorrow feeling rested, sharp, maybe even strong. And while you drink your morning coffee and think everything is basically fine, your body is running a quiet demolition project on the one biological system that will determine whether your 70s and 80s look like independence and capability or something considerably darker. The process accelerating right now in bodies over 60 has a name, it has a measurable rate, and it is being almost completely ignored in standard medical care. Not because doctors are incompetent, but because the current clinical toolkit for addressing it is frustratingly limited, and the supplement that addresses it most directly has spent 30 years being marketed to 22-year-olds in tank tops. That mismatch has cost millions of people in their 60s and 70s something that money cannot buy back. By the end of this, you are going to understand the mechanism precisely, not just the what, but the how. And you are going to understand a three-part system I call the morning anchor stack, which is the simplest, cheapest, and most evidence-backed intervention I have found after 5 years of reading clinical literature, obsessively enough to occasionally make my husband question my sanity. He is, incidentally, the reason I started doing this. About 5 years ago, he had a cardiac event that nearly killed him. Full cardiac arrest, the kind that requires intervention to survive. He was an overloaded entrepreneur in his early 50s, eating on the run, sleeping badly, and assuming that feeling busy was the same thing as being engaged with life. The doctors put him on a stack of medications and implied that this was essentially his life now. I had a different reaction. I got consumed with understanding the underlying biology, what actually went wrong, what the research actually says, and what habits and inputs could rebuild function after 50 when the mainstream advice had clearly failed. We did all of this under medical supervision, with regular blood work and imaging to track real outcomes. I say that up front and without apology, because what worked for one couple in one specific situation will not map identically to your situation, and anyone who tells you otherwise is selling something. But the mechanisms I am going to walk you through today are not personal anecdotes. They are reproducible biology operating in every human body past 60, including yours. The ingredient is creatine monohydrate, a white, odorless powder, roughly 30 cents per serving. Dissolves in your morning coffee in about 10 seconds with no detectable taste and no change in texture. And it has more high-quality randomized controlled trial evidence behind it than virtually any other supplement sold today. The reason you probably associate it with young men in gyms and not with healthy aging past 60 is one of the most instructive examples of how marketing shapes what we believe about biology. The marketing was never aimed at you. The research, increasingly and unmistakably, says it should have been. Let me explain what is actually happening in your body right now and why this specific substance addresses it at the level of mechanism rather than surface symptom. Your muscles are not passive storage tissue. They are metabolically active, constantly being broken down and rebuilt through a process called protein turnover, a kind of biological renovation that never stops. For most of your adult life, the rate of rebuilding kept pace with the rate of breakdown. After 60, that balance tips. The rate at which muscle protein breaks down begins to outpace the rate at which it is rebuilt, and the gap widens with each passing year. Through your 40s, muscle loss runs at roughly 1% per decade under sedentary conditions, barely perceptible. After 60, research published in the Journal of Gerontology puts the rate at approximately 1 to 2% per year. After 70, under sedentary conditions, some studies place the annual loss as high as 3 to 5% per year. This process is called sarcopenia, which in plain Greek translates roughly to poverty of flesh, and it is the invisible villain of every conversation about healthy aging that is not actually being had in your doctor's office. Here is what makes sarcopenia particularly dangerous in a psychological sense, not just a biological one. You cannot feel it happening. There is no pain. There is no blood marker that shows up on a standard annual physical. Your doctor does not measure your muscle mass at a checkup. You wake up one morning and feel perfectly normal, slightly less capable than you were 5 years ago. But you attribute that to aging in some abstract, inevitable way, because that is the cultural framework that has been handed to you. What is actually happening is that your body's primary metabolic tissue, the tissue that governs your insulin sensitivity, your resting metabolic rate, the mechanical loading signal your bones need to stay dense, your brain's neurochemical supply chain, and your ability to survive a fall, a surgical procedure, or a serious illness, is quietly shrinking, and it has been doing so for years before you noticed a single thing. Now, here is where creatine enters, and where the mechanism becomes genuinely interesting. Your body runs on a molecule called ATP, adenosine triphosphate. Think of ATP as the actual currency your cells spend to do anything at all: move a muscle fiber, fire a neuron, pump your heart through a beat, regulate your body temperature. The fundamental problem with ATP is that your cells can hold only a few seconds worth of it at any given moment. The reserve is extremely small relative to your energy demands, so your body needs a rapid recharging system, something that can regenerate ATP almost instantaneously when demand spikes. That rapid recharging system is creatine phosphate. Here is the physical image. Imagine a pre-charged backup battery installed inside every muscle cell and every neuron in your brain. When your regular energy supply runs low for even a fraction of a second during a high-demand moment, this backup battery donates a phosphate group and instantly reconstitutes ATP. The battery is creatine phosphate. It is the fastest energy replenishment mechanism in human biology. Nothing else operates at that speed. By comparison, the other energy pathways, the ones that burn glucose or fat, are slower, more oxygen dependent, and less responsive to sudden demand spikes. The creatine phosphate system is the sprinter. Everything else is a long distance runner. Your body produces some creatine on its own. The liver, kidneys, and pancreas synthesize it from three amino acids: glycine, arginine, and methionine. You also absorb creatine from food, primarily red meat and oily fish. The problem is that as you age, two things happen simultaneously and compound each other. Your body's internal creatine synthesis, the amount you manufacture naturally, declines, and your dietary intake of the foods highest in creatine tends to fall as well, partly because red meat consumption often decreases when people follow cardiovascular health guidance, and partly because appetite itself diminishes with age for hormonal and neurological reasons that are independent of health status. Research published in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition found that the total creatine pool in muscle tissue is meaningfully lower in adults over 60 compared to younger adults, even when controlling for physical activity levels. The backup battery is running at lower charge. It has been doing so for years, and nobody flagged it. This is where I want to pause on what I consider the mainstream betrayal moment, and I find it genuinely fascinating in a slightly absurd way. For decades, the clinical and popular health narrative around creatine went like this: bodybuilder supplement, questionable safety, potential kidney risk, stay away. The kidney concern specifically was studied extensively, and the worry was debunked in healthy adults. A 2017 meta-analysis published in the Journal of the International Society of Sports Nutrition reviewed data from dozens of randomized controlled trials and found no adverse effects on kidney function in healthy individuals, including older adults, at standard supplementation doses. Zero. None. The myth persisted because creatine supplementation raises serum creatinine levels, and creatinine, the metabolic byproduct, is one of the standard markers clinicians use to assess kidney health. When a physician not familiar with the sports nutrition literature saw elevated creatinine in a patient supplementing creatinine, they flagged it as a potential problem. It was not a problem. It was a predictable biochemical artifact. The body was excreting more creatinine because more creatinine was turning over, not because kidneys were failing. These are entirely different phenomena, but by the time the research clarified this definitively, the cultural association had hardened. Creatine equals gym. That was the end of the conversation for most clinicians and most health communicators. Meanwhile, in a different part of the research literature that nobody was paying attention to, a completely separate body of evidence was accumulating, evidence about what creatine does in the aging brain, in the aging heart, in the bone-muscle interface, and in the metabolic systems that deteriorate most dangerously past 60. That research did not get a marketing budget. It did not get a celebrity endorsement. It got published in academic journals that the people it could help most were never going to read. Let me walk you through that research, organized from the least to the most surprising finding, so you understand the full picture of what you are actually dealing with. The most surface-level effect of creatine supplementation in a body over 60 is improved muscular output during resistance exercise. I want to immediately push past the gym bro framing here because the downstream implications are not about aesthetics or performance in any competitive sense. When your muscle fibers can sustain higher mechanical output for longer before fatigue during a training session, the adaptive signal sent to the nucleus of those muscle cells is stronger and more sustained. That signal, mediated through biological pathways including insulin-like growth factor 1 and the mTOR complex, is the actual instruction to rebuild and reinforce the muscle fiber. You are not adding muscle through some chemical shortcut. You are making the training signal louder so that the same hour of exercise produces a stronger adaptation. Think of it as upgrading the antenna receiving the signal rather than increasing the volume of the broadcast. A 2003 randomized controlled trial by Bros and colleagues at McMaster University assigned older adults, average age over 70, to either creatine supplementation combined with resistance training or resistance training combined with a placebo. The creatine group gained significantly more lean mass and saw significantly greater improvements in functional strength measurements compared to the placebo group doing identical exercise protocol, identical supervision. The difference in outcome was attributable to the creatine, specifically to its ability to amplify the quality of the anabolic signal produced by the same physical stimulus. Now let me move to the layer that surprises even people who know something about creatine supplementation. The backup battery system does not operate only in skeletal muscle. It operates anywhere in the body where energy demands are high and rapidly fluctuating, which means it operates in the heart, and it operates in the brain. These are not theoretical extensions of the skeletal muscle research. They are supported by distinct and independent bodies of evidence. Your heart muscle uses creatine phosphate as its primary rapid energy buffer between contractions. During each heartbeat, the heart muscle goes through a brief relaxation phase in which it is resetting and reloading energy for the next contraction. The creatine phosphate system is central to maintaining the power of each contraction, particularly under cardiovascular stress, during exertion, during illness, during the kinds of circulatory demands that become more common and more consequential after 60. Cardiac physiology research has documented that creatine content in heart muscle decreases in individuals with heart failure, and that this decrease correlates with reduced contractile efficiency. I want to be precise. Creatine supplementation is not a treatment for heart disease, and anyone with existing cardiac conditions is navigating that conversation with their cardiologist, not me. But if you are a healthy adult over 60, the creatine phosphate system powering your heart's contractions is a real and active part of your cardiovascular health, not a gym concern. The brain research is where I personally find the evidence most unexpected and most underreported. Your brain represents roughly 2% of your body weight and consumes approximately 20% of your total energy output. It is the most metabolically expensive organ in the body by a significant margin. It runs on ATP, replenished by creatine phosphate. Neurons synthesize creatine locally, using the same enzymatic machinery your liver uses, but their synthetic capacity declines with age and degrades further under conditions of biological stress, sleep disruption, emotional strain, inflammatory load, early neurodegenerative changes. When cognitive demand spikes during a complex task, a difficult decision, a rapid social interaction that requires processing multiple simultaneous cues, and the brain's creatine buffer is running low, the consequences are not dramatic or obvious. They are subtle. They manifest as the slightly longer pause before the word comes, the moment of mental fatigue in the afternoon that was not there at 45. The recovery time after a cognitively demanding day that now requires an evening rather than an hour. A systematic review and meta-analysis by Avdarinos and colleagues, published in 2022 in the journal Experimental Gerontology, analyzed the accumulated results of multiple randomized controlled trials on creatine supplementation and cognitive performance. The finding was clear and directional. Creatine supplementation produced measurable improvements in cognitive tasks, specifically in memory, processing speed, and resistance to mental fatigue. The effect was largest in older adults and in conditions of biological stress. The researchers specifically noted that the older the study population, the more pronounced the observed cognitive benefit. This is the precise opposite of what the supplement's cultural reputation would suggest. The mechanism behind this is worth understanding specifically because it is not intuitive. When the brain encounters an energy shortfall, when ATP regeneration cannot keep pace with demand, it does not slow down uniformly across all functions. It prioritizes. The most ancient automatic brain functions, breathing regulation, heart rate control, fundamental threat detection, are protected most aggressively. The more recently evolved, energetically expensive functions are the first to be rationed. The prefrontal cortex, which manages working memory, decision quality, impulse control, and what neuroscientists call executive function, is disproportionately sensitive to energy supply constraints compared to more primitive structures. This is the biological reason why, under sleep deprivation or extreme metabolic stress, people describe losing sharp thinking while still being capable of habitual and automatic tasks. The sophisticated circuitry gets the budget cut first. Maintaining adequate creatine phosphate supply in the aging brain is not about cognitive enhancement in some idealized sense. It is about not losing ground on the sophisticated cognitive functions you already have, faster than you have to. Now I want to address something that almost never appears in public discussions of creatine for older adults, and it connects to a cardiovascular risk marker that is gaining increasing attention in the longevity medicine space. The molecule is called homocysteine. Elevated blood homocysteine is an independent risk factor for cardiovascular disease, stroke, and cognitive decline. It operates by damaging the endothelium, the thin, smooth cellular lining of your blood vessels. Think of the endothelium as the inner coating on a garden hose. Homocysteine is essentially a chemical that slowly erodes that coating, creating rough, inflamed patches on the vessel wall where plaque accumulates and clots form. Normal, smooth endothelium keeps blood flowing cleanly. Damaged endothelium is where cardiovascular events begin. Your doctor may never have tested your homocysteine. Routine annual blood work often does not include it, despite the fact that elevated levels are surprisingly prevalent in adults over 60. Here is the creatine connection that essentially no one is talking about publicly. Your body's internal creatine synthesis, the process by which the liver, kidneys, and pancreas manufacture creatine from amino acids, is one of the single largest consumers of a compound called SAM, or S-adenosylmethionine. SAM is the body's universal methyl donor, which means it is the molecule responsible for donating chemical groups to dozens of critical biological processes: DNA methylation, neurotransmitter synthesis, and critically, the metabolism of homocysteine into non-toxic downstream products. When your body is working hard to manufacture creatine internally because you are not supplying it from outside, it draws heavily on SAM. That increased demand pulls methyl groups away from the pathway responsible for clearing homocysteine, and blood homocysteine can rise as a consequence. When you supplement creatine directly, the need for internal synthesis falls. SAM becomes available for its other functions. The methylation pathway that clears homocysteine runs with less competition. Research by Stead and colleagues published in the Journal of Nutrition documented this specific mechanism. The human research exploring this relationship continues to develop, and I am not making a definitive claim that supplementing creatine will lower your homocysteine. I am telling you the biochemical pathways are connected, the directionality is favorable, and this is a dimension of creatine's effects that has received almost no public attention despite being biochemically coherent and mechanistically significant. Let me move to the domain that I think most powerfully illustrates the real-world stakes of what we are discussing: falls, hip fractures, the loss of independent living. Approximately 300,000 Americans over 65 are hospitalized for hip fractures annually, according to data from the Centers for Disease Control. Of those, Research consistently shows that roughly 1 in 5 will die within the following 12 months from complications: pneumonia, blood clots, the cumulative physiological insult of surgery and immobility. Of those who survive, approximately half will not return to independent living. These are not abstract statistical outcomes. Each one of those numbers represents a person who was mobile and functional before a single moment that reorganized the rest of their life. The preconditions for that moment — reduced muscle mass, reduced reaction time, reduced balance, reduced bone density — had been building quietly for years before the fall happened. Creatine's connection to fall and fracture risk runs through two separate mechanisms. The first is the direct preservation of muscle mass and function that improves balance, reflex speed, and the ability to catch a stumble before it becomes a fall. The second is indirect and operates through bone loading. Bone density is not determined solely by calcium intake or vitamin D levels. It is determined substantially by mechanical stress, the physical force that muscle contractions apply to bone during movement and exercise. Bone cells, called osteoblasts, respond to mechanical loading by building more bone matrix. When creatine supplementation increases your capacity to generate muscular force during exercise, it simultaneously increases the mechanical loading signal delivered to the bones those muscles attach to. Research by Chilibek and colleagues at the University of Saskatchewan has specifically examined creatine supplementation and bone mineral density in postmenopausal women and found measurable protective effects on bone tissue when supplementation was combined with resistance training over a 24-week period. This is not a direct chemical effect of creatine on bone cells. It is an amplification of the physical stimulus that drives bone remodeling toward greater density, mediated by improved muscular output. There is one more dimension of creatine's effects in the over 60 body that I want to walk through before moving to the protocol, and it connects sarcopenia directly to the metabolic crisis that drives type 2 diabetes and cardiovascular disease. The connection is insulin resistance, and the mechanism is more direct than most people realize. Skeletal muscle is the primary site of glucose disposal in the human body. When you eat carbohydrates and blood glucose rises, insulin signals your cells to absorb that glucose, and the majority of that absorption happens in muscle tissue, not liver, not fat cells, not other organs. Muscle mass, in this sense, is the primary glucose management system in your body. It is a metabolic buffer the size of your entire muscular system. When that buffer shrinks through sarcopenic atrophy, the same amount of dietary carbohydrate produces a larger blood glucose spike because there is less muscle tissue available to absorb it. Insulin is secreted in larger amounts to manage the excess. The pancreas is called on more heavily. Over time, cells become less responsive to insulin's signal. Insulin resistance develops. And insulin resistance left unmanaged is the driver of type 2 diabetes, visceral fat accumulation, systemic inflammation, and a substantially elevated risk of cardiovascular events. This is the compounding cascade that makes sarcopenia so dangerous beyond its immediate functional consequences. Losing muscle is not just losing strength. Losing muscle is losing the biological infrastructure of glucose regulation. And the people most likely to be developing insulin resistance in their 60s and 70s are frequently the same people whose muscle mass has been silently declining for a decade. Creatine supplementation, by preserving and helping rebuild that muscle mass in conjunction with resistance training, is therefore not a gym supplement. It is, in mechanistic terms, a glucose regulation support intervention. That framing will never appear on a supplement label because regulatory guidelines prevent it. But that is what the biology says. I also want to address the single most common psychological barrier I encounter when I talk about creatine with women over 60 specifically: water retention. The fear that creatine causes bloating or makes you look puffy. This belief is worth dismantling carefully because it is grounded in a real mechanism that is being completely misinterpreted. Creatine draws water into muscle cells. This is real. It is an osmotic effect. Creatine increases the concentration of solutes inside muscle cells, and water follows the concentration gradient into the cell. The result is that your muscles become slightly more hydrated. Well-hydrated muscle tissue is more metabolically active, generates more force, and recovers from exercise more efficiently. The water is inside the muscle, not underneath the skin. The subcutaneous puffiness that people associate with bloating or water retention is a different phenomenon driven by inflammation, sodium, or hormonal fluctuation. The intracellular hydration produced by creatine is functionally beneficial, not cosmetically problematic. More hydrated muscle tissue also makes muscles appear slightly fuller, which in the context of sarcopenic muscle loss is not an aesthetic concern but a functional one. A muscle that looks more substantial is at the cellular level more functional. Now let me address something that belongs squarely in the psychology of health category, which is the real reason most people who know about creatine are still not taking it consistently. It is not the cost, it is not the taste, it is not the effort, it is the absence of an attached habit. The decision fatigue research is robust and applicable here. Every deliberate decision you make draws from a finite pool of executive function resources, the same pool your prefrontal cortex is drawing on for everything else you are managing in a day. Habits that attach to anchor behaviors you are already performing automatically have dramatically higher long-term adherence rates than habits that require a new cue from scratch. Your morning coffee is already an anchor behavior. It runs on autopilot. Attaching creatine to it requires no new cue, no new decision, no new reminder system, and no additional willpower expenditure. You take the measuring scoop, you add 3 to 5 grams to your cup, you stir for 10 seconds, and you are done. The compounding effect of that decision across 6 months or 12 months or 5 years is enormous. A person who has creatine attached to an anchor behavior will have a dramatically higher cumulative dose delivery compared to someone who intends to take it and takes it when they remember. Intention without architecture is the most common form of health failure that has nothing to do with biology. Now, a reasonable question about the coffee delivery method. Does heat degrade creatine? Creatine can convert to its inactive metabolic byproduct, creatinine, under conditions of prolonged exposure to acidic liquid. This is a legitimate quality concern for manufacturers producing pre-mixed creatine beverages stored in bottles on shelves for weeks. For a cup of coffee you are mixing and consuming within 15 to 20 minutes, the conversion rate is negligible. The research on creatine stability in hot beverages examined for practical consumption timelines consistently indicates that immediate consumption eliminates the degradation concern. Stir it in, drink it, the chemistry is not working against you on that timeline. Which form of creatine? Creatine monohydrate, not creatine ethyl ester, not crealkaline, not creatine hydrochloride, not buffered creatine, not any of the patented variants that exist in the market primarily because the patent on creatine monohydrate expired decades ago and companies needed a proprietary angle. Creatine monohydrate is the form used in the overwhelming majority of the published research I have referenced today. A comprehensive review published in the Journal of the International Society of Sports Nutrition in 2021 concluded that no alternative creatine form has been demonstrated to be more effective than monohydrate at equivalent doses, and that the health and performance outcomes documented in the literature are specifically attributable to the monohydrate form. You are paying for the research base. Every dollar spent on a superior or more bioavailable creatine form is a dollar spent on marketing written by someone who could not patent the original. I want to return one more time to the invisible villain, sarcopenia and creatine depletion, because I want to make sure you see how these two processes do not simply add their harms together, they multiply them. As muscle mass declines due to sarcopenic atrophy, the body's total creatine storage capacity declines in parallel. Because creatine is stored primarily in muscle tissue, less muscle means a smaller creatine reservoir, which means even adequate dietary creatine intake results in lower absolute stored creatine, which means the energy buffer available per unit of metabolic demand is reduced, which means muscles fatigue faster during any physical activity, which means activity levels tend to drop, which means the anabolic stimulus driving muscle maintenance gets progressively weaker, which produces more muscle loss, which reduces the storage reservoir further. This is the biology of the downward spiral that millions of people experience as just getting old, as though it were meteorological, a weather event beyond human agency. It is a predictable biochemical cascade with identifiable lever points. The spiral is real. The lever points are also real. The fact that this cascade has been classified as normal aging and largely accepted rather than aggressively interrupted at the population level is one of the more consequential institutional failures of the past 3 decades. Not malicious, that is the conspiratorial framing I reject. It is a combination of fragmented academic research across separate silos, gerontology, exercise physiology, nutritional biochemistry, neurology, that rarely communicated with each other until recently, combined with a supplement industry that aimed creatine products at faster revenue demographic segments. The population with the most to gain was the population most systematically excluded from the conversation. That is not a conspiracy. It is an incentive structure operating exactly as incentive structures do. You now have the mechanism. Here is the protocol. The morning anchor stack has 3 components. I am going to be specific enough that you could implement this tomorrow without any further research, because vague recommendations are a socially acceptable form of useless advice. The first component is called load. 3 to 5 grams of creatine monohydrate every morning in your coffee or any hot or room temperature beverage you already consume at the start of your day, not pre-workout, not post-workout, not on training days only. Every morning without exception, including rest days, creatine operates as a tissue reservoir. You are filling a tank incrementally. The reservoir does not understand what day of the week it is. The common mistake with load is taking it only on days you exercise. Saturation of muscle creatine stores takes approximately 3 to 4 weeks of daily supplementation. Skipping rest days extends that timeline and creates oscillating levels that reduce the sustained benefit. Fill the tank every day. The second component is called signal. Your body's creatine storage capacity and the entire anabolic adaptation system it supports require a mechanical stimulus to activate. Consuming creatine without providing your musculoskeletal system with a genuine physical loading stimulus is equivalent to keeping a fully charged battery in a device you never turn on. The signal does not need to be intense, and it does not need to happen in a gym. Research in older adults demonstrates meaningful benefit from resistance exercise performed 2 to 3 times per week at moderate intensity, where moderate intensity is defined operationally as a resistance level that allows you to complete approximately 8 to 12 repetitions before the final 2 become genuinely difficult. That last 2 reps difficulty is the signal your body needs. Without it, you are not triggering the molecular cascade that drives adaptation. The specific error I see most often with signal is substituting walking for resistance training and expecting equivalent outcomes for muscle and bone. Walking is excellent, deeply supported by research for cardiovascular, neurological, and metabolic health, and I would never suggest removing it. But walking and resistance training are different signals to fundamentally different biological systems. You need both, and they cannot substitute for each other. The third component is called anchor protein. Creatine enhances the rate of muscle protein synthesis in response to resistance training, but synthesis requires raw materials, specifically amino acids, and specifically adequate leucine, which functions as the molecular trigger that initiates the anabolic response in muscle tissue. Research in older adult populations consistently shows that adults over 60 require more dietary protein per unit of body weight than younger adults to produce the equivalent muscle protein synthesis response, a phenomenon called anabolic resistance, meaning the threshold for getting the rebuilding signal is higher than it was at 35. The current evidence-based recommendation for older adults who are resistance training is approximately 1.2 to 1.6 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight per day, distributed across meals rather than front-loaded or back-loaded into one large meal, because the muscle protein synthesis response to feeding has an upper ceiling per meal of roughly 25 to 40 grams of high-quality protein. A person weighing 75 kilograms, approximately 165 pounds, needs between 90 and 120 grams of protein daily across at least 3 meals. The most common mistake with anchor protein is not total intake. Most people have encountered the message that protein needs increase with age. The mistake is distribution. A small breakfast, a light lunch, and a large protein meal at dinner does not produce the same anabolic signal as protein distributed across all 3 meals. The biological machinery that builds muscle operates throughout the day. It needs raw materials throughout the day. You would not run a factory on 8 hours of supply delivered in the final hour of the shift. Load, signal, anchor protein. 3 grams to 5 grams of creatine monohydrate in your morning coffee every single day. 2 to 3 genuine resistance training sessions per week with actual difficulty in the final repetitions. 1.2 to 1.6 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight distributed across at least 3 meals daily. These are not aspirational guidelines. They are specific inputs to a specific biological system that responds to inputs with measurable, trackable outputs: muscle mass, bone density, cognitive reserve, metabolic flexibility, and the functional independence that those systems underwrite. The most expensive health assumption you can carry past 60 is that the changes you are noticing are simply the cost of time, that the fatigue is just aging, that the mental fog is just aging, that the gradual loss of strength and resilience is just aging. This framing is not entirely wrong. Time does cost something, and no protocol reverses that arithmetic. But the framing erases the distinction between what is inevitable and what is a predictable biochemical process, with identifiable drivers and addressable leverage points. Sarcopenia is real and measurable. Creatine depletion is real and measurable. The compounding cascade connecting the two is real and has been documented in peer-reviewed literature across multiple institutions for over 2 decades. None of these processes are operating outside the reach of intervention. They are operating outside the reach of passivity. And passivity, I have come to believe, is the most expensive supplement most people are taking. If you are starting the Morning Anchor Stack this week, comment the word AAAAHR below. I read every comment in the first 24 hours of a video going live, and I want to know who is actually implementing this rather than just filing it away as interesting information they will act on eventually. Hit subscribe. The next video in this series covers the second major mechanism in the same aging cascade, the one operating specifically in your glucose and insulin system after 60, and why the muscle loss I described today directly accelerates blood sugar dysfunction in a way that almost no one explains mechanistically.